Ryan Mitchell had always considered himself a hands-on leader. At least, that's how he used to be. In the early years, when Mitchell's table was just a small neighborhood cafe with a single register and a chalkboard menu, he had scrubbed floors, flipped pancakes, and shook hands with every regular customer. But over time, as the brand grew to a dozen locations across Ohio, Ryan found himself spending more hours behind a desk than in a dining room. Quarterly reports, strategic meetings, and investment presentations slowly replaced the late-night dishwashing shifts and morning prep routines that once grounded him. He trusted his district managers, he believed the metrics, but something deep down was beginning to feel off. The first red flag wasn't a dramatic incident, it was a pattern. Week after week, the feedback from the Cleveland Heights branch began to stand out from the rest. It wasn't about food quality or pricing, it was tone. Customers complained of slow service, tired staff, and a lack of energy that clashed with the cheerful, welcoming brand Ryan had worked so hard to build. One even described the atmosphere as grinding, not thriving. When Ryan brought these concerns to his regional team, the responses were always rehearsed. Minor staffing issues. They said, seasonal turnover. New hires need time. Still, the complaints kept coming, and the gut feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger. That gut feeling became a decision the day Ryan passed by. Two senior executives chatting outside the break room. They didn't know he was nearby, that Cleveland store's been short-staffed for weeks. One said, voice low, but the manager keeps insisting it's just the new generation not wanting to work. Honestly, I don't buy it. Ryan froze. That wasn't just troubling. It was a sign of disconnect between reality on the ground and the filtered version that made it to his desk. For a man who built his business on people, both customers and employees, that gap was unacceptable. He made up his mind then and there. If the truth wouldn't come to him, he'd go find it himself. The plan was simple: disappear. For a few days, Ryan Mitchell would become Ryan Walker, a new part-time hire looking for kitchen hours at the Cleveland Heights branch. He cut his hair short, left the Rolex at home, and wore a second-hand pair of non-slip sneakers he found in his garage. His assistant helped craft a believable resume and even scheduled his interview with the unsuspecting store manager. To avoid suspicion, Ryan personally kept the circle of people who knew about the operation to just two: his assistant and a close friend from HR, who promised to monitor internal responses discreetly. When Ryan walked through the back door of the Cleveland Heights restaurant that Monday morning, something hit him immediately, and it wasn't the smell of coffee. It was tension, the kind of tension you can't fake. The kitchen was buzzing with noise, but no laughter. The dining room looked clean but worn, and employees moved with a sort of robotic urgency, fast, tired, and emotionally checked out. No one made eye contact. No one smiled. Ryan had seen busy stores before, but this was something different. It wasn't just about being behind during the lunch rush, it was a team running on fumes. That morning, Ryan stood quietly at the sink, pretending to familiarize himself with sanitizing procedures, but inside his thoughts were racing. What had happened here? What was being hidden beneath polished reports and quarterly summaries? He had come looking for answers, but already he knew this trip would reveal more than he expected. The signs were written in every exhausted glance, every half-hearted greeting, and every mechanical movement from a team that looked like it had forgotten what it felt like to be seen or supported, and Ryan wasn't going to look away. The moment Ryan stepped through the swinging kitchen door into the heart of the restaurant, the energy hit him like a freight train. It wasn't the buzz of a team in flow, it was barely controlled chaos. He'd expected some level of disorganization, but this was different. There were no greetings, no onboarding process, no introduction from the shift lead, just the clatter of pans, muffled voices calling out orders, and the distant ring of a bell that no one seemed to hear. It was Emily Carter who finally noticed him, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a ponytail pulled so tight it looked like it hurt. "You the new guy?" she asked, pushing a stray hair behind her ear without pausing her work. "Ryan, right. Come on, we're slammed." Emily didn't waste time with small talk. She handed him an apron and started rattling off instructions, pointing out where things were, how tickets were organized, and which grill was acting up. She moved fast, almost too fast for him to keep up, but never raised her voice. Despite the clear pressure she was under, she remained composed, courteous, and surprisingly kind. When a customer snapped about a wrong order she hadn't even taken, she apologized without flinching and fixed it in seconds. Ryan watched quietly amazed. She wasn't just multitasking, she was holding the entire shift together, and it was only noon. As the morning dragged on, Ryan found himself assisting wherever he could, refilling sauces, bussing tables, running hot food to the front. It was clear no one had the bandwidth to train him, so he relied on instincts and observations. Emily would occasionally toss him a pointer between orders, never missing a beat herself. What struck Ryan wasn't just how hard she worked, it was how alone she seemed in holding the line. Other employees were trying sure, but their movements were slower, heavier, as if they were used to bracing for things to go wrong. Emily somehow still believed in trying to make it right. Then came Brad Jenkins, mid-40s hair, slicked back crisp shirt, and a gold watch that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He walked in through the customer entrance like a man arriving at a brunch, not into a war zone of short-staffed service. Emily, he barked from across the counter. Table 6 is waiting. Pick up the pace. No hello. No context, no support. Just command and critique. Emily stiffened visibly, but didn't respond. She just nodded and rushed back to the fryer. Ryan watched carefully. Brad hadn't stepped into the kitchen once, hadn't lifted a tray, hadn't asked anyone how things were going, but already he was asserting authority. For the next few hours, Ryan paid close attention. Brad disappeared into the back office for long stretches of time. When he did return, it was only to find fault, never to help. He never asked about staff. Needs never stepped behind the line, never picked up a broom or wiped a counter. His management style, if it could even be called that, was built entirely on distance and delegation, except the delegation came with zero support. Meanwhile, Emily fielded 3 different roles: line, cook shift, supervisor, and customer service rep. It was clear that without her, the entire operation would have ground to a halt. By the time the afternoon lull arrived, Ryan felt a heaviness settle into his chest. He had come expecting to find inefficiencies, maybe even a lazy employee or two. But this was systemic. It wasn't a team that didn't want to work. It was a team that had been left to survive on their own. Brad wasn't just uninvolved, he was the problem. And yet somehow the staff still showed up, still pushed through. Especially Emily, she moved like someone who knew the ship was sinking but refused to abandon it. Watching her now, Ryan began to understand just how deep this went. The question was, how much worse could it get? By early evening, the pace inside the Cleveland Heights branch of Mitchell's table hadn't slowed. It had only shifted. The lunch crowd had bled into the dinner rush, and the staff were moving on autopilot. Now drained but driven by momentum, Ryan had lost count of how many plates he'd cleared or how many trays he'd run to tables. Yet through it all, Emily Carter remained the steady pulse of the operation. She hadn't taken a break, hadn't raised her voice, and hadn't so much as sighed in frustration. She just kept going. When the time came for her shift to end, Ryan noticed her glance at the clock, tuck her phone into her pocket, and head back toward the grill instead of toward the back room. No one stopped her. No one thanked her. She simply stayed. It wasn't long before Brad Jenkins reappeared, his shirt still crisp, his demeanor just as detached. He called out from the corner of the kitchen without moving more than a few steps inside. "Emily, your shift ended an hour ago. Why are you still here?" His voice carried a tone of irritation, as if her dedication was an inconvenience. Emily paused, her hands still mid-motion, while plating a meal. "We're short tonight," she said. Her voice measured. "I didn't want to leave everyone hanging." Brad rolled his eyes, waving her off with a dismissive gesture. "Not my problem. Clock out and go home." There was no appreciation, no recognition, just orders. Ryan, watching from the prep station, felt something tighten in his chest. He expected Emily to push back, maybe even challenge him. She had every right to. but she didn't. She simply nodded, quietly wiped her hands on her apron, and began gathering her things. Ryan watched her closely as she left the kitchen, noticing the slight slump in her shoulders, the way her posture seemed to shrink the moment she was no longer needed. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one said goodbye to her. It was as if her presence, essential all day, could now vanish without notice. But what struck Ryan most was her expression. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was resignation. The look of someone used to carrying too much and receiving too little. Once the front doors had quieted and the clatter of dinner orders died down, Ryan stepped outside for some air. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the sun sinking behind the strip mall across the street. A few cars remained, one of which caught his attention, an older silver sedan with a cracked rear taillight and a children's booster seat in the back. Leaning against it was Emily. She stood still, arms crossed, staring at her phone. From this distance, Ryan couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her free hand rubbed her temple, the way her foot tapped anxiously against the pavement. After a minute, she ended the call, let out a long breath, and climbed into the car with the kind of quiet exhaustion that no paycheck could fix. Ryan didn't sleep well that night. His mind kept returning to the expression on Emily's face as she walked out. He'd seen that look before in former employees who burned out in single parents doing too much for too long, and in his own reflection during the hardest days of building Mitchell's table. But Emily's case felt different. She wasn't just tired, she was trapped, and something about the way she accepted Brad's dismissal without so much as a word didn't sit right. Ryan wasn't just curious anymore, he was concerned, and concern for him always came with action. He decided that come morning he'd find out the truth, not just about Emily's story, but about how many others in his company were silently carrying the same weight. The next day, Ryan arrived before opening. The back door was ajar, and voices floated out into the alleyway. He stopped short when he recognized one of them. Brad. His tone was sharp, impatient. "I don't care if you're short on rent. Emily, you left before your shift ended, and that's not going to fly." Ryan froze, staying out of sight. Emily responded, her voice strained but composed. "I stayed an extra hour. You told me to go. If you wanted the hours, you should have asked." Brad snapped. There was silence then, her quieter reply. "I did. Last week, you cut them anyway." Ryan didn't need to hear more. The truth was beginning to reveal itself, and it was uglier than he thought. This wasn't about miscommunication. This was control. And Ryan was done standing by while it played out. It didn't take long for Ryan to see the full extent of Brad Jenkins's leadership, or lack thereof. After that early morning exchange with Emily, Ryan kept a low profile, working alongside the team while quietly observing everything. What stood out wasn't just Brad's absence, it was the pattern of it. Each shift followed the same rhythm. Brad would show up late, offer a handful of curt instructions, and then vanish into the manager's office for hours. When things went wrong, and they often did, he'd re-emerge just long enough to bark criticism or blame someone before disappearing again. He didn't manage the flow of operations. He monitored it from a distance, waiting for moments to assert control, never responsibility. That afternoon, the restaurant fell behind during the lunch rush. Orders backed up, dishes piled high, and 2 new servers struggled to keep up. Customers began to complain, and tension rippled through the kitchen like a live wire. Ryan saw Emily once again stepping in to cover gaps, running orders, calming frustrated patrons, and helping behind the line when the grill cook started falling behind. It was during that chaos that Ryan overheard the line cook mutter something under his breath. Always the same, never enough hands. Curious, Ryan leaned in as they worked shoulder to shoulder. "You guys always this short?" he asked. The cook, tall, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Marcus Reed, gave him a tired glance. "Always. We've been begging for weeks, but Brad says we can't afford more staff." Ryan didn't reply at first. He didn't have to. The truth was already there, sizzling on the flat top in front of him. The restaurant wasn't struggling because of poor business. The customer flow was steady. The register was ringing, and the tickets never stopped printing. No, the problem was upstream. Someone in charge was choosing not to support the team on the ground. But he doesn't cut his own hours, Marcus added, flipping a burger with more force than necessary. Must be nice to sit in an office all day and still get paid like you're the one doing the work. Ryan nodded slowly, filing that away. The disconnect between effort and reward wasn't just growing, it had already become the culture. As the day went on, the signs of a toxic environment became impossible to ignore. When mistakes happened, which was inevitable given the overload, Brad didn't ask questions, he assigned blame. Loudly, in front of customers, even a teenage server misguided a salad order and got an earful in the middle of the dining room. Another worker accidentally double-rang an appetizer, and Brad scolded her with sarcasm instead of solutions. It wasn't just poor management, it was humiliation as policy. Ryan saw heads bow when Brad walked by, saw employees tense up whenever his name was called over the headset. It wasn't fear of accountability, it was fear of being targeted. And worst of all, it was working not in the sense of productivity, but in the way fear often works. The team had learned to keep their heads down, to accept mistreatment as part of the job. They weren't just doing their duties, they were surviving. No one asked for help anymore, no one expected backup. People like Emily had picked up the slack so many times that others stopped looking for support altogether. And Brad. He seemed content to keep it that way. As long as the numbers added up at the end of the day and the store didn't crash, he stayed safe behind the glass wall of his office door, untouchable and unbothered. By the end of that shift, Ryan stood quietly near the service window, watching a team that was clearly running on empty. The emotional fatigue was etched into every face, every step, every sigh that didn't quite escape. He saw the toll it took, not just physically, but mentally. The way eyes flicked toward the office door every time it creaked, the way laughter was rare and short-lived, the way even capable employees like Marcus moved with the weary rhythm of people just trying to make it through another day. This wasn't just bad management, it was a broken system. And Ryan knew that the longer it remained hidden under spreadsheets and polished manager reports, the more damage it would do not just to this location, but to everything Mitchell's table was supposed to stand for. The more time Ryan spent at the Cleveland Heights branch, the more cracks he saw forming beneath the surface. By now, he was no longer just playing the part of a new hire. He was blending in, moving among the staff, understanding their routines, watching their unspoken rules of survival. But nothing unsettled him, quite like what he saw on Emily Carter's face the night she left early. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from a long shift. It was the kind that came from carrying burdens no one else could see. She walked out with her head down, her lips pressed tightly together as if holding something back. Ryan stayed late, pretending to finish wiping down counters, but really he was waiting to see where she went, to learn what wasn't being said. Through the window, he spotted her sitting alone in an old sedan at the edge of the parking lot. Her forehead rested against the steering wheel for a moment before she picked up her phone. Ryan watched from a distance as she spoke into the receiver, her other hand rubbing her temple in a slow, weary circle. He couldn't hear the words, but her body language spoke volumes. Tense, shoulders, clipped, gestures, a deep exhale before she ended the call. Moments later, she drove off without looking back. Ryan didn't sleep well that night. He couldn't shake the image of Emily folded over the steering wheel like she had nowhere else to let the weight fall. And he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something or someone was pushing her to the edge. The next morning, Ryan arrived before sunrise, slipping in through the back entrance. He wasn't supposed to be on shift yet, but he had a purpose. The manager's office was closed, but voices drifted through the cracked door. He stopped just outside, careful not to make a sound. "You left before your shift was done." Brad's voice snapped from inside. "I stayed an extra hour," Emily replied, calm but clearly strained. "You told me to go." Brad's tone turned colder. "If you wanted the hours, you should have asked." A pause, then Emily's voice even quieter. "I did. Last week, you cut them anyway." Ryan's stomach dropped. That was it. Confirmation. This wasn't miscommunication or accident. It was deliberate manipulation, and Brad was using scheduling like a weapon. By midday, Ryan began to notice the pattern everywhere. The schedule was a control mechanism, not a tool for efficiency. He saw it in how shifts were assigned, in how people were punished with fewer hours for minor mistakes, or worse, for asking questions. Brad played favorites, openly using hours to reward compliance and silence dissent. When workers pushed back, they suddenly found themselves with 2 shifts a week instead of 5. It was exploitation disguised as management. And the worst part, no one reported it. They couldn't afford to. For most of them, like Emily, losing hours meant not making rent. For others, like Samantha Lopez, it meant not affording childcare. That truth came to a head during the early dinner rush when Samantha, a young mother with 2 kids, paused between orders to glance at her phone. She didn't step off the line. She didn't miss a beat. But Brad saw her. "You texting again?" "Samantha," he shouted from across the room. "Maybe I should cut your hours too. Seems like you've got plenty of time." The dining room fell silent. Samantha froze, her cheeks burning red. "My sitter was supposed to pick up my daughter," she said quietly, almost apologetically. Brad rolled his eyes. "Not my problem." Ryan's blood boiled. This wasn't oversight. It was cruelty, public, performative, and entirely intentional. That moment stuck with Ryan long after the shift ended. It wasn't just about Samantha or even Emily. It was about an entire culture that had been allowed to rot under the surface. A place where fear and exhaustion were normal, where asking for basic humanity came with consequences. Brad didn't just neglect his staff, he crushed them, one passive-aggressive comment at a time, and somehow they still showed up, still did their jobs, still tried to hold it all together. But Ryan had seen enough. He wasn't just going to document the problem. He was going to fix it. And to do that, the first step was clear. Brad Jenkins had to go. The restaurant had finally gone quiet. The last customers had paid their checks and shuffled out into the night. Chairs were flipped onto tables, mop buckets rolled across the tile, and the hum of the soda machine filled the silence where conversation used to be. Ryan stood near the kitchen pass, wiping down a counter for the 3rd time, more out of habit than necessity. He wasn't thinking about the mess anymore. He was thinking about the moment that was coming, the one he'd been building toward since he first stepped through the back door disguised as a trainee. Tonight it ended. The lies, the fear, the manipulation. And it was going to end face to face. Brad Jenkins was exactly where Ryan expected him to be, in the office, slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone, while the remaining staff mopped and stacked chairs. The contrast was almost theatrical. Workers dragging their feet through exhaustion, while their manager rested in fluorescent comfort. Ryan knocked once, then opened the door. Brad glanced up lazily. "You need something?" he asked, his tone flat, indifferent. Ryan stepped in, shut the door behind him, and took off his work cap. He brushed a hand through his hair, letting the silence stretch for a beat. Then, meeting Brad's eyes squarely, he said, "Yeah, I need you to understand exactly who you've been talking down to for the past 2 days." Brad frowned, clearly confused. Without the faded uniform and ball cap, Ryan looked different, sharper, more composed. Still, it didn't click. "Not yet." "Excuse me," Brad muttered, shifting in his seat. Ryan reached into his back pocket, pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Then he turned it toward Brad. The company website loaded front and center. Ryan Mitchell, founder and CEO of Mitchell's Table. Brad's eyes flicked from the phone to Ryan's face, his posture stiffening in slow, dawning horror. "That's a good joke," he said with a weak laugh, but there was no conviction behind it, just fear dressed in denial. Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of 2 days' worth of observation, disappointment, and quiet rage. "I watched you disappear while your staff struggled to stay afloat. I saw you humiliate Samantha for checking on her child. I listened while you cut Emily's hours as punishment for being too dedicated. And I watched a team of hard-working people pick up every mess you left behind day after day." Brad opened his mouth, scrambling for a defense, but Ryan kept going. This wasn't leadership. It was cowardice. You ran this restaurant like a tyrant behind glass, and we're done pretending that's acceptable. Brad tried to recover. Look, managing a place like this isn't easy. Sometimes people need a push, that's all. But the words sounded empty even to him. Ryan stepped forward, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably final. You didn't push them. You broke them. You used fear to cover up your own failures, and now you're done. The silence that followed was crushing. Brad's mouth twitched, but no words came out. Ryan let it hang there a moment longer before delivering the final blow. You're fired. Effective immediately. Pack your things. You won't be back. Your severance will be reviewed, but don't expect much. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. Brad just sat there frozen, knowing there was no escape. Ryan turned without waiting for a response and walked back into the dining room where the remaining staff were finishing their closing duties. Emily looked up from a supply list, eyes narrowing with uncertainty. Samantha was wiping down a table. Marcus stood near the fryer, arms crossed. They all turned toward him as he cleared his throat. "Brad's gone," Ryan said simply. The room fell silent. A few seconds passed before the realization hit. Relief flooded their faces, not loud or celebratory, but deep and undeniable. And then quietly, hope began to return to the space where only dread had lived before. The dining room was still and quiet, save for the soft whir of the dishwasher in the back and the low squeak of rubber soles on freshly mopped tile. Ryan stood at the center of the room, his presence no longer disguised, no longer hiding behind an apron or alias. A few of the staff stared at him, unsure if they had heard him correctly. Others exchanged hesitant glances, disbelief etched across their faces. It was Marcus who broke the silence, arms crossed as he leaned against the fryer. "You serious?" he asked, not with anger, but with that cautious hope that had been buried for too long. Ryan nodded. Brad's gone. As of tonight. There was no applause, no cheering, just the kind of quiet that comes when tension finally starts to unravel. Emily stood a few steps behind the counter, frozen with a clipboard in one hand and a dry erase marker in the other. Her brow was furrowed in confusion, her eyes scanning Ryan's face for any sign this was all some elaborate prank. "He's really not coming back?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Not tomorrow. Not next week." Ryan met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "He won't be walking through that door again." She exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying on her back. Around her a subtle shift began, the kind that starts not with noise, but with breath. Shoulders relaxed, hands unclenched. For the first time, the room felt like it belonged to the people inside it. "I want to say something else," Ryan continued, his voice calm but certain. "You all deserve better than what you've been getting. And starting tonight, that's going to change." He turned to face Emily directly. "For months, maybe longer, you've been doing the job of a manager without the title, the recognition or the pay. You've been the one keeping this place running, holding your team together and setting the standard without being asked." Emily's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Ryan smiled gently. "That ends now. Effective immediately, you're being promoted to assistant manager." For a heartbeat, the room fell into stunned silence. Emily blinked the marker, slipping slightly in her grip. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. Her voice carried the weight of exhaustion and pride, the cautious joy of someone who'd learned not to expect good things without strings attached. Ryan stepped closer. "Then don't say anything yet. Just show me what this place can be with real leadership." Slowly, her expression shifted, not into a smile, not yet, but into something deeper. Resolve. Ryan turned back to the team. "There's more. We're reviewing pay rates across the board. Some of you haven't seen raises in years. That's unacceptable. Fair compensation is coming. Not just promises, but paychecks that reflect the work you do." He could see the disbelief start to melt away inch by inch. Schedules will be balanced no more, punishing people with fewer hours just because they speak up. We're bringing in more help, and when we hire a new general manager, It won't be someone we pull off a corporate spreadsheet. It'll be someone who's earned your respect, not demanded it. Samantha looked up from where she'd been wiping down a table, her posture just a little straighter now. Marcus nodded slightly, his usual skepticism softened. They weren't celebrating yet, but they were listening. And more importantly, they were beginning to believe Ryan let his final words hang in the space they now shared. This restaurant is going to be different because you all are different. You deserve leadership that actually shows up, that listens, that works beside you, not just above you. With that, he stepped back, giving the team space to absorb the shift that had just begun. Emily tucked the marker into her apron, a quiet determination rising in her stance. For the first time since walking into the Cleveland Heights location, Ryan felt something real take root. Not just progress, but ownership. A new beginning built from the inside out, and it was only the start. The next morning, the sun rose over Cleveland Heights with a quiet sense of possibility. It wasn't the kind of morning that felt dramatically different, not to those driving by on their usual commute, or to customers who would soon walk through the doors expecting their usual breakfast orders. But inside Mitchell's table, something had shifted. Ryan Mitchell arrived early, just as he had the day before, but this time he wasn't wearing a disguise. No hat, no apron, just a plain grey button-down jeans and a look of quiet focus. There was no pretense now, no need to pretend. He wasn't a new hire anymore. He was the owner, and for the first time the team knew it. Inside, the crew was already starting their prep routines. A few heads turned as Ryan walked in. The air was thick with uncertainty. It was one thing to promise change. It was another to prove that it was more than just a moment of theater. Ryan didn't make a speech. He didn't call a meeting. He grabbed a rag and helped clean the soda machine. He stocked napkins. He prepped sauces. Slowly, deliberately, he folded himself into the rhythms of the morning. Some employees kept their distance at first. Others nodded cautiously, unsure of how to interact with the CEO who'd spent days mopping floors beside them. Ryan didn't push. He just showed up over and over, moment by moment. By mid-morning, a subtle current began to shift in the room. Emily, now assistant manager, moved with sharper confidence. She began checking inventory and updating the schedule with a clipboard in hand. Her voice had more command now, but not the kind that echoed from authority. It came from respect. Near the back, Marcus worked quietly at the grill, but Ryan noticed the way he took an extra moment to answer a question from a new hire instead of brushing it off. And when Ryan pulled him aside near the brake station, Marcus didn't hesitate. "We need people who actually want to work," Ryan said. "Not just warm bodies. You've been here the longest. Who do you trust?" Marcus didn't need time to think. "I've got 2 names," he said. "Let me make the calls." Ryan nodded and made a decision on the spot. "From now on, you're part of the hiring process." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" Ryan met his gaze. "Dead serious. We can't rebuild this place without the people who've already held it together." Marcus cracked the smallest smile Ryan had seen from him, yet more nod than grin, but the kind that meant something was beginning to thaw. It was more than delegation. It was empowerment. And in that moment, Ryan knew this change wasn't just about removing a bad manager. It was about installing a new kind of leadership, one rooted in trust, not title. Throughout the rest of the day, Ryan remained embedded in the daily flow. He wasn't there to observe, he was there to participate. He worked the register during the lunch rush. He helped a teen server refill drinks when her tray nearly collapsed. He caught a small detail in the supply log that saved the team from running out of paper goods. Every action spoke louder than his job title ever could, and slowly the team responded. They weren't smiling wide yet. They weren't cracking jokes in the kitchen like a family, but they were looking up more often, meeting his eyes, taking initiative. The exhaustion was still there, but now it was mixed with something else belief. That evening, Ryan lingered near the back office watching Emily as she wrapped up the schedule with 2 newer employees giving input beside her. Across the room, Samantha wiped down the booths without needing to be asked. Marcus was training someone on fire safety, explaining step by step with the kind of clarity only experience can teach. Ryan didn't interrupt. He didn't make a speech or call attention to the moment. He simply stood still, letting the scene unfold. This was no longer the restaurant he'd walked into just a few days earlier. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was different. It was alive again. And as the lights dimmed and the staff clocked out, Ryan made a silent promise to himself. This culture wouldn't just be rebuilt, it would be protected. The following morning brought with it a quiet rhythm, the kind that hinted at routine, not the kind shaped by dread or chaos, but the kind built from structure, respect, and subtle optimism. Mitchell's table didn't feel like a battlefield anymore, it felt like a workplace. Samantha Lopez was the first to approach Ryan that day. She waited until the rush had died down, and the restaurant was in that in-between space, too late for breakfast, too early for lunch. She stood by the drink station, hands tucked into her apron, her voice low but honest. "I don't mean to sound ungrateful," she said, "but I've been here long enough to know that change doesn't always stick. People make promises, things go back to how they were." Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix it with a speech. He just nodded. "Then don't believe me yet," he replied. "Just watch." And she did. They all did. Over the next several days, Ryan didn't just continue showing up. He remained in motion. He restocked shelves, rolled up his sleeves during the dinner rush, and quietly reviewed scheduling requests with Emily to ensure no one was being overlooked. When Marcus recommended a former colleague for a line cook opening, Ryan interviewed the candidate himself. And when Samantha needed to leave early to attend a parent-teacher conference, Ryan personally took over her register. These weren't grand gestures. They were choices. Intentional, consistent, and grounded in the principle that no position was beneath him and no staff concern too small. It didn't take long for the culture to shift. Staff began speaking up more in meetings, suggesting layout changes for efficiency, sharing ideas for customer service improvements. A server suggested a better labeling system for the condiment bar. Another employee, quiet and previously withdrawn, volunteered to train a new hire after observing how Ryan coached others. Fear, which had once governed every shift, started to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish overnight, but it receded, replaced little by little with ownership. This wasn't just about being heard, it was about being respected. For the first time in months, the team wasn't just trying to survive the day, they were building towards something. One afternoon, Ryan sat down in the dining room after the lunch rush, notebook in hand, watching the flow of service. Emily slid into the seat across from him. "I think we're turning a corner," she said, cautious but sincere. "People actually want to be here again." Ryan smiled and closed his notebook. "Then it's time we talk about what comes next." Because for him, this transformation, this rebuilding couldn't stay boxed inside a single zip code. The problems he uncovered here weren't unique to the Cleveland Heights branch. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, a growing distance between leadership and labor, between policy and people. Ryan knew the only way to prevent this from happening again was to rewrite the system company-wide. That week, Ryan drafted a new operations mandate. It wasn't just a set of rules, it was a philosophy. Every Mitchell's table location would be assigned a leadership liaison chosen from within, someone trusted by the staff. Every general manager would undergo a re-evaluation not just of performance metrics, but of character and employee feedback. Staff would have a direct communication channel to corporate. No more layers of insulation, no more reports that hid the truth. Pay structures would be revised, training systems rebuilt, and internal promotions prioritized. He called it the ground floor initiative because the best change, he believed, didn't start at the top. It started right where the customers stood, where the food was served, and where the people worked. On the final day of his stay in Cleveland Heights, Ryan stood near the exit doors, watching the team prep for another evening rush. There was laughter, now occasional, but real. Jokes passed between co-workers. Tasks were delegated without resentment. Emily moved with quiet authority, and Marcus trained a new hire with visible pride. Even Samantha, once bracing for disappointment, had started offering ideas for community outreach. As the first dinner guests began to file in, Ryan took one last look around. This had once been the most troubled branch in the chain. Now it was the blueprint for all the others, And for the first time in a long time, Ryan Mitchell wasn't just running a company. He was building a legacy. If this story moved, you don't let it stop here. At Deep Inside HQ, we believe every voice matters, especially the ones that have been ignored for too long. If you've ever worked a shift that felt thankless or stood beside someone who carried more than they should, this is your story too. Subscribe to our channel for more true, powerful narratives that shed light on injustice and celebrate real change. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and join us as we continue uncovering what lies beneath the surface. Because sometimes the truth is the first step toward transformation.